In the meantime, I'm going to turn it over to James, who is officially our co-chair of our newly introduced infrastructure task force. So James, handing it to you.
Thank you very much. My name is James Paxson. I'm the general manager for Hacienda, and as Lindy mentioned, the new co-chair for the transportation component of the new infrastructure group. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here to the meeting this afternoon. One of my favorite adages, I like it, a lot of people get pained when you hear it, but it's the one that goes, failing to plan is planning to fail. And I think there's a lot of truth in it. And so one of the things that I'm particularly pleased about is the opportunity to hear about one of the very important planning efforts that's going on in the greater Bay Area right now, which is Plan Bay Area 2050. We're going to be focusing on the transportation component, but I think one of the things you'll hear in the presentation is that one of the things that's happened with the Plan Bay Area process over the years is it's become more and more comprehensive, and there's a lot of things that are now on the table. And we have housing and transportation, which are kind of now being combined, which was not always the case. But we have things like environmental resilience, economic disparities that need to be resolved, a housing crisis, and of course now we have COVID-19 on top of everything else. So there's a lot on the table, a lot to talk about, and I think we're going to get an opportunity to kind of dive into that plan a little bit today and find out more about the planning effort, where it's at, and the important things that we need to be focused on in the East Bay as the plan develops. What I'd like to do now is to go ahead and pass the baton over to Leo Scott. Leo is the new Vice President of Infrastructure. This is kind of a new sort of structure within the East Bay Leadership Council. And he's going to provide some opening remarks and some introductions.
Hey, James,
yes.
Can I just ask that everybody mute themselves? We're getting a lot of background noise.
Oh, okay.
So that would be super helpful. Thank you very much. Continue,
Great.
James.
No problem. A couple of things about Leo. Leo's not only the president of Graybo and Scott, but I want to kind of highlight the fact of how hands-on and active Leo is in so many efforts. I think, it would be easy to kind of sit back and just sort of be the president of your company and deal with a lot of the transportation and planning issues that Graybo and Scott deals with. But Leo is involved in a lot of other things and at a really, really personal level. And it's been really a pleasure working with him over the last several years. And so with that, let me please introduce to you Leo Scott, who's going to do some introductions and get everything ready for our presentation.
Great, thanks, James. I appreciate the intro. The analogy, James, that came to my mind was the intersection of housing and transportation. That is Plan Bay Area 2050. To use a transportation analogy, I'm sure there's a housing analogy that would work, but we'd have to have Heather or someone else share the housing equivalent of that analogy. So because this is really the first infrastructure task force meeting where we're combining our housing task force effort and our transportation together. And as we go forward now, all of the meetings of this type will work at both of them together as much as we can, although from time to time we'll have a transportation focus and then a housing focus and then a combined focus. So this was a great way to kick off an infrastructure task force on transportation and housing, because as James said, that's what Plan Bay Area 2050 is all about. And what we have is Raleigh McCoy, who's one of the planners, has been working on it, knows the plan intimately, will share in detail about it. But I thought it would be very helpful for us to hear from Contra Costa's one of the two Contra Costa members of MTC, Amy Worth, longtime council member and vice mayor in the city of Orinda, and also former chair of MTC and multi-year member of MTC. How your tenure is closing in on 10 years, right? Something like that. You're muted, so.
Okay, great, perfect, yeah.
So anyway, Amy, what I asked Amy to do as our representative, Contra Costa representative MTC, was introduced from her perspective as an elected official and leader on the board, how she sees the Plan Bay Area effort being important to us in the county. And I must also add to it that many of the transportation funding decisions that get made in the Bay Area start in the Plan Bay Area 2050 process. So to be ahead is to be included in the Plan Bay Area. So this is an important decision-making document for transportation funding, and increasingly so for housing. So it's a very important thing for us as a policy advocacy body to understand how it's developed and how it gets applied. So with that, I'll turn it over to Amy and let you kick us off, Amy.
Okay, well, great, Leah. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And first of all, I just wanted to say, over the years, it has been such an honor to work with the East Bay Leadership Council. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had some issues arise, and I picked up my cell phone and I called Kristen, and she just sent me back all the information I needed. You know, you have been so involved over the years in the advocacy efforts and the planning efforts. Your strong base of understanding the importance of transportation to our county and our residents that are of all the counties. We have more people that commute from, you know, long distances from, you know, their homes to work outside of the county. We're kind of a donor county when it comes to workers. We're trying to actually make some changes. That's why we're really grateful to have, you know, Bishop Ranch close to home and then Hacienda next to home, so that we can provide jobs for our residents to you know, not have to travel those long distances. And as a matter of fact, just the other day I was listening to the workshop we're doing community outreach, and there was Kristen on the line asking about the jobs housing imbalance. It only used her first name, but I knew which Kristen that was, asking the questions and trying to really, this has been one of our big pushes to increase jobs out in the East Bay, where we have such large, you know, housing and residents. And also on this call today, I just want to, you know, acknowledge and welcome Luella Haskew. And Luella represents Central Contra Costa County on the Transportation Authority. So if you have any really tough questions about particular projects, Luella is the expert. But I just wanted to set the tone and then turn it over to Raleigh, who's really the pro in this. And as Leo and James both mentioned, that planning in the Bay Area has evolved over time. We started doing this over 50 years ago, and we have federal and state laws that require each metropolitan planning organization to do long-range planning. Every 4 years, it's a rolling 25-year plan. Now, what's different now with the passage of Senate Bill 375 by Darrell Steinberg, and he's, as you know, now in Sacramento as the mayor, living the dream, and they are, so what we do is when we do the long range planning, we do transportation plans. So when I first came on the commission, all we did was transportation planning, and we'd plan it. What SB 375 says, it's we have to plan both transportation investments and housing investment. And so the idea is that housing and transportation are so closely linked that we do this together. So this is why we have this huge planning process that incorporates both transportation investment and housing transportation. So you've heard a lot about RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation Process. In the Bay Area, ABAG does that planning. And Julie Pierce was going to be here today, but she is literally in a RHNA meeting right now. That's it's a huge challenge because there are a lot of different perspectives as to how we should distribute housing within the Bay Area. And our press has always been, we need to put more jobs near people. And whether that's building housing where the jobs are or moving the jobs to where the people are. This has to be a significant part of this plan, which we are continuing to work on. And as you know, Raleigh's probably going to talk about the priority production areas, which is an outgrowth really of the work of this group and of the, East Bay EDA and the Northern Waterfront Project to really recognize that we have, you know, significant job opportunities to develop. But so that's kind of where we are. I really want to give the most time for Raleigh to present to you. Again, I want to thank her for being here. You know, you all can understand, because you've all been involved in this planning process, how extensive, what a huge process this is. This planning effort is gigantic. It involves tremendous outreach around the region, engagement by stakeholders, elected officials. It's a combination of ABAG and MTC. And this is all being done in the context of COVID. This is all being done in the context of the fact that our staff no longer right now can come together in the offices and work together. It's all being done remotely. And people have suggested, well, shouldn't you just defer it and wait? Well, the reality is all the federal and state transportation funding hinges upon us doing this plan. And it is so fundamental that in order for a project to even get any kind of regional, state, or federal funding, it has to be in this particular plan. So that was a big piece. For example, decades ago when we built the Caldecott Tunnel, the first thing was we had to get that tunnel in the regional plan. We had to work the politics. We had to, someday when you and I were all together for a glass of wine, I can share some of those wonderful stories of how we got that plan, that project in the plan, and ultimately got it funded. I often think of transportation projects, these large projects, like a layer cake. You just keep having to add layers and layers of funding to finally get to the point where we can construct. But so we are in the sort of thick of the transportation planning process. And we are, again, you have been very much engaged. The letters that you wrote for our last meeting, MTC meeting at the end of July, were really important as we look to move projects forward within the plan. I think one of the brilliant moves of combining, you know, the East Bay leadership, you know, creating the East Bay Leadership Council brought Contra Costa together with Alameda County in terms of a lot of these projects that are really important to all of us. So that was a very important effort that you all mounted and will continue to do so as in the coming months. So I'm pleased that you've created this, you know, kind of revisioned the task force to include all aspects of infrastructure. And then today we're going to be talking mostly about transportation, but they are all, you know, transportation and housing are linked together. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Raleigh McCoy. And she is one of our star planners at MTC, among a constellation of stars. She has taken a huge role in this planning process, not only the planning up to this point, but now as we move forward. So she has a real understanding of the region as well as the various priorities for individual counties. She got her undergraduate degree from the University of North Carolina, and which I'm pleased about because my grandmother's family comes from North Carolina. But also she came to the Bay Area and got her master's degree in regional planning from Berkeley. And as you know, Cal has one of the preeminent planning, environmental design, regional city and regional planning programs I think in the world. Anyway, she is here to talk with you today about this process. I know some of you participated in the community outreach program that we had, what was it, a week or so ago in Contra Costa County. And again, thank you for participating in that. And so without further ado, I am so honored to turn the Zoom platform over to Raleigh for her presentation.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you everybody for tuning in today and for attending this meeting. So I will share my screen and we can get started. Okay, hang on 1 second. All right, everyone can see the title slide? Okay, So I am here today to really let you all understand where we are in the Plan Bay Area 2050 process, where we've been, where we're headed, and really the focus of this presentation, as Commissioner Wirth said, will be on transportation, but I'm happy to provide additional input as well, additional updates on the things that are going on that relate to housing, the economy, and the environment within the Plan Bay Area context. And I think you all have a pretty strong understanding of what we're doing with Plan Bay Area 2050, but I just wanted to provide a little bit of background first at the top to get everyone on the same page. So Plan Bay Area 2050, it's really the blueprint for the next 30 years of regional policy in the areas of transportation and housing, the economy, and the environment, with different strategies nested within Plan Bay Area 2050, helping to advance the region toward accomplishing this adopted vision here, which is to ensure by the year 2050 that the Bay Area is affordable, connected, diverse, healthy, and vibrant for all. So within that, we have proposals for transportation strategies, and these are both policy-based, policy-based interventions that would be implemented by local jurisdictions or counties or even at the state level. For housing, additionally with transportation, as you all are probably well aware, there's also a host of infrastructure projects, investments in our region's freeways, local roads, and transit systems. With housing, we're looking at a similar set of policy-based strategies, helping to promote housing production, affordability, and housing security. And part of that as well is this set of geographies. So historically in Plan Bay Area, we've used a series of locally identified areas for growth called priority development areas, where local jurisdictions will nominate places within their communities that they think are really ready for housing development. In Plan Bay Area 2050, we're still using that priority development area framework, but we're expanding our focus a bit beyond that and also examining the impacts of allowing for more housing development in other areas that are considered to be suitable for growth whenever we speak to our stakeholders at jurisdictions and counties, as well as when we speak to the public. And that includes examining increased housing growth both near high quality transit, so within walking distance of rail or ferry, high frequency bus, as well as in areas of high opportunity, so areas that have historically been exclusionary or really adverse to housing construction, but that have all these great resources for opportunity, things like well-resourced schools and access to parks, healthcare, jobs, and the like. So looking at housing in that sort of a lens. Complementary to that are our economic strategies. Again, a number of policy-based strategies examined in Plan Bay Area 2050 that look at ways to increase worker stability through making sure that benefits are distributed evenly to gig workers as well as to full-time employees. Also looking at a series of geographies where local jurisdictions nominate priority production areas. These are really complementary to those priority development areas. But instead of areas that are locally nominated for housing, these are areas that are locally identified as places that are great candidates for increased job growth, particularly in uses such as manufacturing, logistics, distribution, that are real epicenters of middle wage job growth in areas where job growth in areas that can really lead to economic opportunity. And finally, looking at the environmental picture, both in Plan Bay Area, we have two key themes, one of which is looking at ways to help make the Bay Area more environmentally sustainable by reducing our climate emissions and other impacts on the environment that come from human sources, but also making sure that we as residents of the Bay Area are in a good position to weather future storms that may be coming toward us, things like increased threats from sea level rise or major earthquakes or even wildfire. So also looking at ways to really improve the resilience of our population. And as Commissioner Wirth was mentioning, historically the focus of Plan Bay Area has been transportation. In more recent iterations of our regional plan, housing has grown to become more prominent. But this is really the first regional plan that's also looking at these themes of the economy and the environment. And it's really exciting to be applying this puzzle piece approach to the proposal for Plan Bay Area 2050 and seeing how all those pieces work together. One thing just to say moving forward, the real body of Plan Bay Area 2050 is a document that's called the Blueprint, which outlines all the strategies and more that I was referencing. A little bit on where we are in the process. We really initiated the Plan Bay Area process over 2 years ago with a pre-planning, scenario planning effort, which is called Horizon, where we really integrated the concept of uncertainty into our long-range planning, understanding that there are a lot of forces outside of the region's control that will really shape the regional perspective, both today in 2021, as well as looking out into 2050. But we're here in August of 2020. We're just at the beginning of the final blueprint phase. Over the past 6 months or so, staff have been engaging with members of the public, formatting a proposal, and doing a first run at some of those strategies. And that document was the draft blueprint, which was released for the public comment in July and August of this year. Now, taking what we learned from our analysis using our simulation model of developers and households and transportation conditions, as well as our economic modeling, as well as taking into account all the feedback that we've heard from our partners at local jurisdictions and counties and from members of the public, we're now in the process of crafting that proposal for the final blueprint, which we'll be sharing with our stakeholders and with our committees in September of this year. Once we have the final proposal approved, we'll advance into another round of modeling and study before finally moving into the creation of the Plan Bay Area 2050 document, the creation of the implementation plan, which really looks at the next steps toward advancing Plan Bay Area 2050, a near-term plan for implementation that identifies those first steps, as well as completing the environmental impact report, which is one of our statutory requirements. And additionally, as Commissioner Worth was mentioning, the undercurrent running parallel through all of this is the Regional Housing Needs Allocation ARENA process, which is currently in full swing right now. In the next few slides, I'm going to just briefly cover some of the highlights from the analysis of the draft blueprint. The draft blueprint looked at 25 bold strategies across 9 themes. And since this is a transportation committee, I'm really going to focus in on the transportation strategies that were studied, as well as some of the impacts related to transportation. There are 3 themes related to transportation and around 10 strategies, 10 to 12 strategies within the field of transportation in the draft blueprint. The first tranche of strategies really looked at how we can set a strong baseline for the transportation system that we have today and that we would have by the year 2050. And so under that theme of maintain and optimize existing infrastructure, we looked at a number of strategies, including making sure that we have enough funding set aside just to keep our baseline conditions in effect through the year 2050, making sure that our local streets and roads, bridges, freeways, and transit assets don't degrade at minimum when we go out until 2050. We also, within this strategy, looked at a pretty bold proposal for encouraging folks to rethink driving, or helping to sort of raise up that price of driving from what it is today so that the market price of driving matches the social price. So in another way of saying that, looking at a per mile tolling strategy on freeways that are served by transit. So there is still that option. Under the healthy and safe streets theme, there are really 2 strategies at play. One, which would look at largely expanding our investment in active transportation infrastructure. So sidewalks, safer intersections and the like, as well as lowering speed limits on freeways as well as local streets to really help create people-first streets that are safer for all users, drivers as well as cyclists and pedestrians. And then within the draft blueprint, when it came to transit, there were 3 main strategies. So the first is taking a look at fare policy within the region. As it's set up now with our 27 operators throughout the region, passengers who are taking a multi-operator trip are often having to pay 2 nearly full fares whenever they transfer from one transit operator to the next. So we thought about what would happen if there was one regional fare based on the distance traveled with no transfer penalties. How would that change people's travel behavior? And what would the effect be on transit operators and their fare revenue? So we studied that in the draft blueprint. We also looked at a very highly limited number of new transit projects, understanding that more transit projects would be layered on in the final blueprint, but really wanting to focus in on a few of the most resilient to uncertainty, most equitable transit projects in the region, so just around 10 of those highest performers. And most of these transit projects that were studied in the draft blueprint tended to be relatively low-cost investments, things that are a good bang for the buck. Things like bus rapid transit, helping to expedite bus service, frequency increases on our region's bus and light rail lines, as well as the extension of BART to Diridon Station. However, while there were several low-cost transit projects, there was one big transit project that was also studied in the draft blueprint, and that was a second Transbay rail crossing linking Oakland to downtown San Francisco. So together, all of those different strategies that I just referenced comprised our staff proposal that was studied for the draft blueprint. I spoke a little bit about some of the transportation strategies that were studied in the draft blueprint, but this slide here as well just really reiterates some of the most bold and interesting, really envelope-pressing strategies that were studied. So again, it was that investment in 7,000 miles of new bike lanes and off-street paths, that fare policy that was creating a more seamless regional experience for our transit passengers, those lower speed limits, both on freeways as well as local streets, that help reduce emissions as well as create a safer on-street experience for all users, and that all-lane tolling strategy, which helped price corridors and generate revenues, actually, that could then be reinvested in new transit projects. So a few key highlights from our analysis of the draft blueprint. When we look at affordability, one of the most important metrics of success when we talk to members of the public, the draft blueprint was able to reduce the combined share of household income spent on housing and transportation costs by about 10 percentage points between 2015 and 2050. And really, it's important to look at the combined cost of housing and transportation. I'm sure you all are well aware there's often a trade-off, with lower housing costs equating to higher transportation costs, the whole drive until you qualify approach, if you will. When we look at how the share of household income spent on housing and transportation varied, specifically for our lowest income residents in the Bay Area, these gains were even greater than what you see. However, by 2050, with the average household spending just under 50% of their household income on housing and transportation, this suggests that there still is quite a ways to go for our analysis and for the region if we want to create a Bay Area that really is affordable for all residents and not just those working in the highest paid sectors. Also, on the topic of affordability, when we look at the construction of permanently affordable or deed-restricted affordable housing units in the region, by 2050, with the addition of new revenues that could be generated perhaps through a sales tax, like the concept that had been bandied about in 2019 before the current situation that we are in now really set in with the economic recession. If we had these new revenues to fund more affordable housing production, our analysis suggested that by the year 2050, the region could add 400,000 new affordable housing units, and that equates to roughly 1 unit for every 1 new low-income household that's expected to pop up in the Bay Area by 2050. Turning to connectedness, our transportation and housing connection, which really is so critical. I was really just agreeing with everything that was being said in the introductory remarks about the essential element of combining planning for those two. Whenever we look at the share of all housing in the Bay Area that's located within walking distance of high-frequency transit, so about a half mile or a 10-minute walk, in 2015, around 1/3 of all housing units in the Bay Area are located within that half mile of transit. By 2050, with strategies that encourage more housing growth in transit station areas and nearby to transit, that number increases by about 10% to 43% of all housing units being located within walking distance of transit. And keep in mind too that these numbers refer to all housing units. So they also account for the millions of housing units that exist in the Bay Area today that can't necessarily be moved. And when you look at the share of new housing that's produced within a half mile of high frequency transit, that number is going to be much higher than the 43% that you can see on the slide. Turning now to some stats from our analysis as relates to the healthy guiding principle of Plan Bay Area 2050. Another key issue and focus area for MTC and ABAG is the issue of safety on our region's roads. And several jurisdictions throughout the Bay Area, including the largest cities in the region, have already passed Vision Zero mandates, aiming to reduce fatalities on our region's roads to zero, and acknowledging the fact that even one life lost in transit is too many. Plan Bay Area 2050, through our speed limit reduction strategy or through the increased investments in bicycle infrastructure, does reduce the number of fatalities or serious injuries on the region's roads, with our analysis suggesting that over 1,500 fatalities could be avoided due to those slower speeds and increased investments in infrastructure. However, this is still far from the zero fatalities that we would like to see on our region's roads by 2050. In other news, resilience also saw some really significant advancements. Policies to protect homes that are at a high risk of damage in a serious earthquake, so those that are really at high risk. Policies that would provide funds to subsidize or advance funds through a revolving loan program enabled 100% of all homes at high risk of damage from earthquake to be retrofitted to better withstand the shakes that come with a major earthquake. And on the topic of sea level rise, with the addition, again, of some new revenues that could be funded by parcel taxes, by a sales tax, there are a number of different options that are really on the table here. Our analysis identified investments that would protect 98% of all homes from 2 feet of sea level rise through the year 2050. And I'll just acknowledge here that Plan Bay Area 2050 in the draft blueprint, it is a bold proposal for the next 30 years, and it does involve the generation of new revenues beyond what we project to currently have at our fingertips if we kept today's resources sort of as they are looking out to 2050. But given all the challenges that our region is facing and the need to really act aggressively and boldly, there are a number of new tax measures that are incorporated within the draft blueprint. And there's a worry that adding on these new tax measures could really impact the economic growth that had been so strong in the Bay Area in the prior years, prior to this economic recession that we're in now. Our economic modeling suggests that even with these new tax measures that I've mentioned that would fund some of these aspirational strategies in the blueprint, our economy and our Bay Area businesses really are still positioned to thrive and to grow. And we look at economic output per capita in constant today's dollars. Between 2015 and 2050, the average Bay Area resident is expected to be about 65% more productive when it comes to that economic output. So this is reassuring news that our analysis suggests that even with these new tax measures, the benefits that they generate, the value that they generate, would not impede economic growth in the region. If we saw that number trending closer to zero or even trending in a negative direction, that would be a real alarm bell for us, but we're not seeing that with our analysis here. However, there is one key goal of Plan Bay Area 2050, statutorily required by Senate Bill 375, that I do want to update you all on. So Senate Bill 375, it establishes per capita greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. In Plan Bay Area 2040, which was adopted in 2017, that goal was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation by 15% over 2005 levels by 2035. However, some things have changed when it comes to the assumptions that we have about what conditions in the Bay Area are going to look like. Namely, the region has grown at a faster rate than was expected when we adopted Plan Bay Area 2040 in 2017. So the population is growing faster, more jobs are created, and also the region is more affluent. And with more revenue or more resources for the individual households, people are just driving more than we expected when we did our best guess effort in 2017. Additionally, another key factor that really influences that greenhouse gas emissions reduction performance is the cost to drive. So we have here two assumptions, a low cost to drive or a moderate cost to drive. But either one of those options is still a bit less, so less expensive to drive than what we were assuming would happen with Plan Bay Area 2040. There are a number of other exogenous or outside of our control forces as well that are also leading into this, but the bottom line is if we test all the investments and policies that were in Plan Bay Area 2040 using the best information that we have today, those investments would actually only get us to around a 1 to 4 percentage point reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. So far below that 15% goal and the 15% performance of Plan Bay Area 2040. Looking at those bottom two arrows, you can see the performance of the draft blueprint, those strategies that I was just mentioning. And based on the cost of driving that we assume, if it's low or moderate, the draft blueprint is only getting us around half to 2/3 of the way there to this new 19% per capita reduction by 2035. And that translates to a 7 to 10 percentage point gap that we will need to close with new investments, new strategies, or revisions to what was proposed in the draft blueprint. And I can't underscore enough that this gulf is significant, and it's really going to take dramatic and bold action to meet that statutory requirement with the final blueprint. Now, just to briefly preview some of the proposals for the final blueprint that we'll be studying, presenting in September of this year. There are a number of exciting new strategies that we'll be including that relate to transportation. Primarily, a much larger investment in our region's transit infrastructure with investments in regional rail, bus service, and ferry service throughout the region. Complementary to that is the completion of the express lanes network, those high occupancy toll roads that allow carpoolers or even single occupancy vehicles to bypass congestion on our region's roads. And with that, really leveraging the investment of the express lanes network by operating express bus service that can provide a multi-county ride with just one seat, no transfers needed, and really make express bus service a more attractive alternative to driving, especially when you get to bypass all of the cars that are sitting in congestion beside you. The blueprint will also be looking at a limited selection of improvements on our region's freeway system and our highways, improving intersections, interchanges to make them safer and more operationally efficient, as well as a few highway widenings where necessary, but really also keeping in mind with this particular strategy that trade-offs do occur between making it easier to drive or increasing roadway capacity and those greenhouse gas emissions that we need to reduce as part of our statutory requirement. And finally, really the baseline of our transportation system, all of that local bus and light rail service, will also be looking at additional projects that would enhance local transit frequencies and capacity and provide a more attractive and faster, more reliable resource for all the transit passengers in the region. In the next couple slides, I'm just going to go through a really high-level preview of a selection of some of the projects that would be proposed for inclusion in the final blueprint. And this was shared in July of this year when our commission took action approving a list of transportation projects and their regional discretion and sort of projects that we wanted to support with some regional funding within the Plan Bay Area context. So when we look at that interchanges and highway bottlenecks strategy that I was just referencing, there are a number of operational improvements proposed, things like Bay Area Forward, which would really just sort of pinpoint areas of bottlenecks or congestion and apply these operational improvements like metering on on-ramps or bypass lanes for buses and the like to help really make the region's roadways flow more smoothly. In the East Bay, we're also looking at projects on SR4, as well as a key creation of a link between SR4 and Byron Highway through that SR 239 project, as well as looking at this project in Alameda County for SR 262 or Mission Boulevard, helping to really expedite and make that a safer and more free-flowing facility. When it comes to enhancements to our local transit systems, there are a number of projects proposed for the final blueprint, a number of bus rapid transit projects to help make bus service faster and more attractive, as well as general frequency boost projects for AC Transit and for Muni, for Sonoma County Transit. And in Contra Costa County, there are also some select frequency boosts or new service as well to point out. When it comes to our regional rail network, again, really the marquee project that addresses one of the most crowded transit links within our region, the Transbay Tube for BART. A big investment, really transformational in that second Transbay rail crossing still being proposed in the final blueprint, as well as a number of complementary projects like a frequency boost on both BART as well as Caltrain. Again, the extension of BART to Silicon Valley Phase 2, so Diridon Station, as well as a few light rail projects in the South Bay to support enhanced growth, and Valley Link, a key interregional transit connection linking the Central Valley with Alameda County and at the Dublin Pleasanton BART station. And finally, talking about the express lanes and the vision for that moving forward, in the final blueprint, in the early years of the plan, we would propose to see the build out of the regional express lanes network, providing that alternative to congestion for carpools and buses and drivers that want to pay the additional fee. I mentioned some express bus service that would really complement that investment. There are several new express bus routes that are proposed within the final blueprint, including a bus service linking Vallejo with SFO Airport along I-80, connections between Redwood City and Oakland along the Dumbarton Bridge, as well as connections on the peninsula linking Diridon Station with San Francisco. Also, some other complementary projects like increasing frequencies on AC Transit, Transbay bus lines, express bus service on I-680 in Contra Costa, and additional service on this express bus that connects Napa with Vallejo. With that, just to preview a couple of next steps for the plan, we just completed our public engagement on the information that I shared with you, and staff at MTC and ABAG are still processing all of the comments that we received from members of the public and our partners at nonprofits, counties, and cities. All of that is really leading up to a proposal for transportation, housing, the environment, and the economy that would be presented in September of this year. And pending approval of that package of strategies, that would set staff up to do another round of analysis in the fall of this year, which would then generate more exciting information for us to really ponder as we move into the full plan writing stage. With that, I think we have a bit of time. I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you again for the opportunity to present today.
Great, thank you very much, Raleigh. And I'm going to take a point of moderator privilege and quickly say, go Bears. Thanks for your presentation this morning. We do have a couple of questions that have come in on the chat, and I would ask anybody who'd like to. We'll try and cover as many of these topics as we can in the time that we have remaining. And Lindy, I'm going to look to you to make sure that I don't overshoot the clock here. The first thing that I wanted to just really start with generally, and just a quick response if you could. One of the things I appreciate about East Bay Leadership Council is that they really try to take sort of a more global look at things, but we are an organization that's devoted to looking at the economic health and well-being in the 680 East Bay corridor. And I was wondering if you could just talk really quickly about those projects that are on the list. And maybe it's a project that's not necessarily in our own backyard that should be of particular, we should be particularly interested in, that will particularly help transportation in our area.
Mm-hmm. So a couple of projects are coming to mind. The first is, of course, as you all are well aware, on the Express Lanes corridor, those express lanes, there are some that are already in operation, others that are in construction or in the permitting phases. So the Plan Bay area would see the build out of a contiguous link on I-680 of express lanes, helping to bypass traffic congestion. And I referenced this proposal from Contra Costa's Transportation Authority for express bus service, really trying to make I-680 a multimodal corridor and providing I know there's already transit service on I-680 today, but an enhanced express bus, sort of high amenities, a nice level of service that you would receive. So I think that is a really exciting opportunity for creating a meaningfully competitive alternative to driving on the corridor. I think that is going to be very exciting. Additionally, for folks that are driving, there are several operational improvements on I-680, especially looking at the interchange between SR4 and I-680 that would help really facilitate and clear up a bottleneck that I know can often be an issue for roadway conditions today. So several phases of that being included in Plan Bay Area 2050. I know that some interim work is already under study now, but we would see sort of in the near term improvements there. And also, I think that I really appreciated all the jobs, housing, sort of imbalance discussion that was had at the beginning of this presentation. So the other thing that comes to mind is in the interim, while we are living within the jobs, housing imbalance situation that we're in today, and understanding that the need for high quality BART service in the East Bay is not going away if we ever resume to a level of demand for transit that we were seeing in the previous years, that second Transbay Rail crossing is going to would really alleviate congestion and crowding conditions on BART, and also provide some redundancy in the, God forbid, event that the Transbay Tube ever had to cease operations for maintenance or for some sort of an emergency condition. So that would really help clear up some of those recurring delays that we see on BART. So there's good news for rail riders, for bus riders, and for drivers in the East Bay.
That's great. Thank you very much. Quickly on the point of the new look at the integration of housing and transportation, I think we're kind of really in round 3 of where the plan really calls for that look. As we were talking earlier, the Housing Methodology Committee was meeting today to kind of look at the RHNA allocation. Is there anything in the potential RHNA allocation scenarios that would make anyone rethink some of the transportation priorities? For instance, is there an allocation that might come out of the housing that would change how anybody would think about what transportation priorities should be included in the plan?
That is a good question. So for me, the first thing that's coming to mind is our initial looks at the RHNA allocation are suggesting that we're going to see pretty substantial population growth in the South Bay. And I think that when it comes to local transit options in the South Bay, VTA service is not quite competitive with driving in many instances. So I think that it really could necessitate another look at what Plan Bay Area 2050 is doing to improve transit and active transportation, so biking and walking, particularly in the South Bay. For you all in the East Bay, I think that there will still be housing growth in RHNA in the East Bay, so we'll need to plan our transportation for that. But I think here's what I'll say, which I don't actually have an answer for, but which I think is quite interesting, is in Plan Bay Area, our focus has been so strongly on greenhouse gas emissions in the past that co-locating housing and transit was a no-brainer. But with RHNA, there are other objectives that are also really coming to the fore, an interest in advancing equity and allowing for more housing in suburban communities that have historically not generated a large number of housing units, particularly housing units that are affordable to low or moderate income households. And while adding housing in those suburban communities, it could have a really strong impact on advancing equity, it does make transportation planning a bit more challenging because those are less dense communities. They're not as easily served by transit. And it's a tough puzzle to solve, and not one that I have an immediate answer for, but I think that is something that we at MTC and ABAG will need to be reckoning with.
Okay, very good. Going to the discussion on funding, we had a couple of questions come in. One, if you could just briefly describe how the tax analysis was done, And also, if you could talk about sort of the role tolling plays in the scenarios, and to what extent, for instance, does tolling revenue play in being able to help solve some of the funding gaps?
Those are great questions. So I will caveat up front that I'm not an economic modeler, so I will try to do justice to my colleagues' work. So we really designed the tax measure that we studied around a proposal that mirrored the faster proposal that was being discussed, this transportation funding sales tax measure. So the parameters were quite similar to that. Originally, we had looked at the impacts of studying that tax measure beginning in the year 2036, but based on some urging from our commissioners to be bolder and to think about what could happen if we acted with more urgency and sooner on that measure, we actually moved the tax measure up a few years to start before 2035 so that we could generate funds to pay for some of these transit projects that are so needed to help us meet our greenhouse gas emissions goals. So it was modeled as a sales tax, at least the new revenues for transportation were. However, I don't think that by no means commits the region to pursuing that type of a funding measure, but we did want to integrate one option into our economic model. On the question of per mile tolling, a real best practice when it comes to instituting these per mile tolling policies is that you take the money that you reinvest, you take the money that you earn, you don't put it just into the general fund, but that you reinvest it in alternatives that improve transit alternatives so that you're not just extracting money from drivers without giving them something better in return. So in our analysis suggests that with the toll in place, we would generate at least $15 billion when adjusting for inflation between 2030 and 2050. So that money is incorporated into the proposal for the final blueprint and would fund investments like frequency increases on BART, frequency increases on Caltrain. It even could be used to fund active transportation or a reduced fare for low-income transit passengers. So that is a key component of our proposal and would be really integral in the implementation plan when we think about how we start to take the steps to set up these strategies, is drawing a very clear line between reinvesting the revenues into transit projects.
Great, thank you. With regard to sort of the evaluation of benefits within the plan, do you look at, for instance, the change in trip generation or the change in trips overall along certain corridors? And is there a way for us in the East Bay to quantify the improvement in conditions by looking at, for instance, relative trip generation in certain corridors and what those changes might be with the plan?
That is a statistic that we look at, and then another related statistic is average travel times along key corridors. And what our analysis really showed there that really backed up our assessment that the per mile tolling strategy could be beneficial is that when you look at how travel times compared between 2015 and 2050 corridors that were where the per mile tolling strategy was applied, saw much lower increases, or in some cases decreases in travel time. And that's because people were being disincentivized from driving, they were choosing other modes. When you compare that with corridors that did not see tolling or only saw tolling on part of the corridor, so I'm thinking of US 101 in Marin County where there was no tolling because there wasn't a real meaningful transit alternative there. Travel times were increasing really dramatically just because we have more residents, more workers, more transportation in general. So we do look at trip generation, we look at traffic patterns and how congestion patterns are changing. And that is one of our guide stars, trying to help people spend less time in transportation.
James, I'm going to chime in here and just let everyone know we've only got about a minute or so to wrap up, and I know we had lots of great questions. So I just wanted to ask Raleigh if possibly she would share her email so that we could continue to have this conversation as we kind of wind down this meeting, but hopefully continue it through email with those of us who didn't maybe get to our questions.
I would be happy to do that. I can
Great,
send
thanks.
it. You can feel free. Yeah.
Actually, if you could post your email in the chat, that would be great,
That would
and
be
then
great.
people can pick that up and
Yeah.
ask their questions. So, am I hearing we're out of time at this point? All right. Well, there are some really good questions, and I really appreciate it. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to everybody. So, some really thoughtful stuff in here. We had a very good question on greenhouse gas emission changes and a little bit on why we didn't meet the targets in 2040 and what's the prospect of meeting those going forward. Some other questions about infrastructure too. And so with regard to especially electric vehicle charging stations and some other things that I think are going to be important for meeting some of those greenhouse gas emission standards. So thank you all for your participation today. It's been a pleasure and really, really appreciate the informative presentation and thoughtful discussion. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Please thank you all at MTC and ABAG for your really hard work and for the heavy lift for doing regional planning, which I think is a really fundamentally important thing for our region. So with that, I will call us adjourned for the day. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us.